So Charlie, here we are, different format.
It sure is.
Health History Horses live with an exclamation point.
But this is great. This is wonderful. Yeah.
So we didn't think we were going to be live and in person. We thought this was going to be an audio format.
Very true.
And so let's tell everybody where this all started. This was a brainchild of mine that I developed after going to a women's physician leadership conference and thinking to branch out of my practice of medicine. And so I posed this to you at a Saratoga History Gala, and you bit.
Oh, yeah.
So we got to go back to the fall of 2019, which is pre-pandemic. And so here we are 2 years later and trying to get this off the ground. The original Health History Horses, everyone, was an audio-only podcast. And I thought we would marry my health knowledge with your history knowledge and bring in some horse history and knowledge. So we do that on our podcast. Now we've had 5 podcasts so far.
Hard to believe, but we have. Yeah.
They were living and residing on the Saratoga History Museum website. However, the files were too large and was crashing the website.
Yeah, it was a problem.
So no one has heard episode 5, which we recorded over the summer. So maybe we'll be able to get that out there in the airwaves.
Sounds good.
So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Christine Alexander Decker. I'm a clinical endocrinologist and I'm a born and bred native of Saratoga Springs. And I love this city, and that's why I wanted to develop something that dovetailed my medical knowledge and the history of Saratoga. And so that's where Charlie comes in.
I'm Charlie Kuenzel, and a lot of what Christine just said is what I am. I'm a native Saratogian. I taught in the high school, junior high school arena here in Saratoga for 36 years, and owned a company called Saratoga Tours for 20 years with my good old business partner, Dave Patterson. But I'm presently serve as president of the Saratoga Springs History Museum. And I have always loved Saratoga history. So Christine and I, as soon as we talked at this gala, it was a no-brainer that this would be a beautiful fit for at least the 2 of us, if not 3 or more of us. So it's been an absolute treat working with you so far. Thank you.
So as Charlie said, Mr. Patterson, Dave Patterson, who is one of my very favorite people at the Saratoga High School, is part of the creation of this podcast. But he has moved to Florida temporarily for the winter, as he does every winter.
Yeah.
And so we may see him on future versions of this.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
And I think it's our intention that we bring in some other guests to talk about their areas of expertise in health and horses as well.
Absolutely and positively, yeah.
So today's topic, and let me go back, actually the former topics that we've had on Health History Horses included an introduction to what I do, and I'm an endocrinologist, and I'll explain that to everyone who doesn't know what endocrinology is. We talked about the history of insulin and Saratoga in the 1920s. We've talked about iodine and the waters, and that's what Saratoga is most famous for, is its waters.
Correct.
And I brought in the thyroid because that's the gland that uses the iodine. The vaccine talk that was pretty prominent this spring.
Oh, yeah.
And we started off with the smallpox inoculations. And then the last episode, which was all about summer, which you haven't all heard of yet, was the summer of, was it 1874 that we talked about in Saratoga? One of the most famous summers.
Good memory, 1874, right.
And so here we are. And today's topic is all very contemporaneous. So it's fall, autumn, and things are falling all around us. Leaves, acorns, temperatures, daylight hours. So I thought we would talk about falls, physical falls, people falling. And because of that, in endocrinology, we talk about osteoporosis and what happens if you fall and break something. So that's going to be my health topic.
I'm going to be touching on a fall topic that I think a lot of people in the Saratoga region gravitate to as we get closer to Halloween. Having been in the Canfield casino for probably over 10 years on their board, we are starting to become known more and more as a spot for paranormal investigations. So we'll be talking a little bit on ghost tours, and then we'll do a wrap up of the track. Now that it's November, you're into a period where the Oklahoma track, the training track, is closing down, and we're looking at what kind of things are available in the city, mostly in the way of museums, and I'll touch on those later.
All right, so let's start with falls. So falls are pretty common when you're a child and you're adolescent. It's part of growing up, and kids fall all the time. They have a way of stop, drop, and roll, so they don't necessarily get hurt all the time. But adults falling is a totally different story. As you know, reckless things that we might do could promote dangerous things to our bodies. So falls in adults can be very life-changing. 1/4 of adults over age 65 fall in a year. So 1 in 4.
Wow.
But only half of them tell their doctor they've done it.
Oh, okay.
Because either it's embarrassing or, hasn't amounted to anything.
Okay.
However, it is true that falls in healthcare are a big deal, because an adult who falls, it can be a significant consequence to their overall health. It could change how they take care of themselves. It may change how other people have to take care of them, and it could lead to complete lack of independence any longer. So falls in older adults are serious business. They're extremely expensive, and one quote that I read was that Medicare dollars are over $50 billion a year in fall care. So we have doctors who take care of people who break things, and so that's a very prominent business. And the nursing home business and the rehab business after a fall is very significant. And in one quote that I read, like 300,000 falls over age 65 in a year, which is tremendous. Mm. So there are 2 types of falls, and one of them is called a traumatic fall, and we recognize those. It's a action fall. You are doing something active and you fall, and not something that's fairly simple. But another type of fall is a non-traumatic fall, and those are the dangerous ones because they lead to fractures. And fractures in healthcare are a very big business as well, and are very serious, because after a fracture, that really changes a patient's independence as well. 2 types of fractures. And remember, when I was a kid, do you remember this, like, oh, somebody fractured their arm? Didn't it sound like it wasn't as bad as broke your arm?
I guess so, yeah.
Because I can remember that nuance when I was younger, that fracture wasn't as bad as a break. They're the same level of commitment, it's broken. Okay. And there are 2 types of fractures in medicine. There are traumatic fractures, and there are fragility fractures. Those fractures happen with low impact, casual activities, falling out of a chair, breaking something, falling from a standing height, breaking something, lifting something that's not very heavy, breaking something. Those are the fractures that in the endocrine world we talk about, because of those are related to osteoporosis.
Sure.
So what is osteoporosis? And this is one of the bread and butter things that I do as an endocrinologist every single day, is take care of bone loss over time.
Oh, yes.
All right. So osteoporosis is, I would say, pretty much universal as time goes on. And we talk about it much more in women, I think, than we do in men, but men develop osteoporosis. Postmenopausal women, that's where we are having these discussions about protecting the bones. So osteoporosis is a chronic condition of the weakening of the bones over time, which leads to the potential for fracture. Mm. So we in women's health see osteoporosis as a chronic condition, just like diabetes is a chronic condition, high blood pressure is a chronic condition. We're going to be treating these women and men for a very long time. I think we're missing the men more than we are the women. Yeah. Women are living longer, and so we're now talking about this more postmenopausally.
Sure.
The discussion really revolves around how do we prevent that fracture. Mm. All right. Osteoporosis is the loss of bone over time is rapid in some women, depending on their health, and slower in decline in other women, but it's somewhat universal. When the women go through menopause and the estrogen production is stopped, that bone protection is lost. And so that osteoporosis risk increases over time. And because the osteoporosis risk increases over time, so does the fracture. And so I call it the osteoporosis chain. And I talk to my women that the chain is running down the track, and until we stop it or slow it down, it's running right towards a fracture. And people are surprised to hear that, but that's the real truth, is that we're trying to prevent that first fracture.
Sure.
And so then we look at the people and say, well, who's going to get that fracture? Not everybody's going to fracture. We need to protect the ones that are going to fracture. And so we can do a risk assessment of our patients. And factors include age, everybody's getting older, history of a fracture, and history of a fracture meaning a vertebral fracture, spontaneous vertebral fracture, that shouldn't have happened. Hip fracture from a non-traumatic injury, that shouldn't have happened. Wrist fracture falling down, that really shouldn't have happened. Though I scratch my head when I talk to my women about this too, because if I was ice skating and I put my arm out, I'm probably going to break my arm. But these women are falling and hurting themselves. Right. So previous fracture, serious risk, and probably the two biggies are age and previous fracture. Other risk fractures include cigarette smoking, excessive alcohol intake, chronic steroid use, which is prednisone, and other corticosteroids for autoimmune diseases. Parental hip fracture. So I'm always asking my patients, have your parents have a hip fracture? Because that is a significant risk fracture down the road.
Okay.
And then we use these markers to kind of get an assessment of who's at risk. The most fractures occur in the patients, not with the worst bone mineral densities, in fact, but bone mineral densities. And that's because there's more women in that group. The denominator's larger.
All right.
So this risk fracture assessment really helps us. Last thing I want to say about this, and then we can monitor or decide, but with imaging, how bad are a person's bones. And that's called a Dexa, and it's a simple x-ray. It measures bone mineral density, measures how much the bone has lost over time. And we look at a couple different types of bone, the lumbar spine, and we look at the hip. And sometimes we can use a surrogate marker of the wrist as well. And that gives us a comparison of age-related, women to women of the same age, and then controls of younger patients who are have healthier, stronger bones. And so those two things, both Dexa and those risk factors, would determine who's going to get treated.
Wow.
So talk to us about the first, I would say that first fall in Saratoga, that patient that brought the topic of waters to Saratoga.
Oh, well.
It wasn't really a fall, but it was an injury.
Yeah, it is. I mean, a lot of times we joke that the first August visitor to Saratoga was Sir William Johnson in August of 1771. Now, Sir William Johnson had been a military leader for the British in the French and Indian War, and he would eventually be in the American Revolution on the British side. But he was spending many years in the Mohawk Valley as the agent for the Crown for Native American affairs in North America. He became very close with the Mohawks, who were the indigenous tribe in the Mohawk Valley, and he actually married into the tribe, and he was well respected, and he did do a good job of trying to administer fairly to the tribe. But he had been wounded in the Battle of Lake George in 1755, and the medical records on this, Christine, I got to tell you, they're a little thin. We know he had a musket ball that entered the upper thigh. It was rumored, and because there's no documentation on this, but it's rumored that it was so close to an artery that the surgeon said, "I will not take it out." So he sutured it up, and he lived with that lead ball in his leg for the rest of his life, which gave him a lot of problems. And he was hobbled around and couldn't sleep and had all these problems. So from that medical condition, which was probably a partially shattered hip or femur or something like that because of the
traumatic fracture.
Thank you very much for that clarification, but true, I should have put it in those terms. The Mohawk felt sorry for him, and they ended up divulging to the first European at the time the location of the High Rock Spring, and of course the name Saratoga comes from a Mohawk term Saratoga, which means area of the Great Salt Springs. So Saratoga in general was highly revered by the tribe, and they didn't want anybody here. He's the first, and then of course it's a slippery slope after that because he's gonna, as we laugh, he takes quill to parchment and starts writing all of his friends. Next thing you know, they gotta start coming in and broker deals, and then formation of the city of Saratoga takes place. So it all becomes, why did we get discovered? Why we were let in? It was
an injury.
Yes, something traumatic like that. So,
yep.
Yeah, very
so
good.
Tell us about some of the skeletons, since we're talking about the skeleton of the Canfield Casino.
I'll tell you.
Or of the city in general, because there's lots of ghost stories of Saratoga.
There really are, and most of those were documented by the late Dave Pitkin. Dave and I were very good friends. He taught social studies in the junior high that was the predecessor to Maple Avenue Middle School. And he authored about 9 books, if I'm not mistaken, on the topics of paranormal and ghosts in the Northeast, Saratoga County, Saratoga Springs, etc. And Dave and I worked on quite a few things. Now, remember, my background is science, just like yours, but I started out with geology, and then at the end I went to astrophysics and astronomy. So people find this hard to believe that I am an integral part of ghost tours in the Canfield Casino, but we fell into it. We honestly and truly did. I'll tell you the story real quick, quick as I can. We were at a board meeting in February about 11 years ago, and we were sitting around taking care of business midweek at night, and probably many people like yourself have served on boards. And the one thing is, after a couple hours of doing just regular old session of work and things, you're thinking about the next day that you've got to go to work at your regular job. So usually when we adjourned around, let's say 8:30, 8:45, it was a foot race down from the second floor where we met out to everybody's car, and everybody jumped in their car and took off and went home. This one particular night, like I said, it was in February. It was very odd because at the end of our discussion, we made a motion to adjourn, and everybody kind of stood or sat and put things away, and it was slow. Now, it may have only been slow for 20 or 30 seconds, but it was enough time for the board to kind of calm down. The noise level was low, and it allowed a person younger than I at the end of the table who kind of looked uneasy. And as I was putting my stuff away, I caught his eye looking like he was very, very worked up. And finally, he uttered the words, "Hey guys, if I tell you what happened to me in here when I was alone the other day, will you promise you won't laugh?" Now, that's one of those things that you kind of go, "Oh, yes, please tell me everything."
Yeah.
I will
Full
not
disclosure.
smile. Trust me, I won't even smile at this one. And you're thinking, "Oh, what's he going to say?" And he came out with something that was paranormal in nature that had happened to him when he was there alone. And I watched all the eyes around the table change. It was really something. They were all like this, and slowly everybody around the table began to tell their own story. And I always joke, it went from a board meeting to a confessional real quick, where everybody was pouring out their heart with, "Well, 5 years ago this happened to me, and 3 months ago this happened to me." And it was the first time that all of us at one table had acknowledged the fact that so many things had happened. We connected the dots, and it took somebody that was a little bit younger than I to say, "Hey, there's a show on TV, it's on the Sci-Fi Channel, it's called Ghost Hunters, and they do investigations on things like this." Now, our director, Jamie Perillo, was sitting to my right, and once those words were uttered and people were like, "Oh, maybe we can have them come," he starts whispering in my ear, "Shut this down. We can't be known as the Nut Palace of the East," something to that effect. So, you try to kind of bring people back, but they were really excited about it. So we decided to let it happen. Next day, they made an application online, and there was a spot in there for not only contact information, but maybe 250 characters to identify a common story or two that was of interest of the building. We had a hard time supplying one or two because there's so many. And then big disclaimer at the end, which said, please allow 6 to 8 weeks for us to contact you because we're so overwhelmed and so busy, we really can't get back to you, but we promise we will. And we submitted it electronically and we started closing things up, and 45 minutes later they called. And they said, do you have more stories? And we said, yes. And they said, can we talk? So they came that summer, they did it undercover, and we went into this with the whole idea that we thought it was kind of fun. It was like, okay, they're going to do an investigation. And they did. They then took all of the action that they had that night that they'd recorded, and they put it through an editing process, etc. And then they called us and they said, we're done. We're going to air it live. Your premiere will be, I think it was like October 13th. It was very timely for Halloween. And they said, just so that you know, you'll be live, blah, blah, blah. This will be the first time. So we looked at ourselves and we said, that's kind of neat that we'll be featured on national TV. So we put together a night where we filled the ballroom to the fire capacity, which was around 300 and some odd people. And we got a large screen and projected it. And it was a live show of called Time to Be Touched. And for anybody that's viewing this, you can look it up. If you YouTube it, it'll be episode 618. 6th season, 18th episode. We tell everybody that comes through to look it up because you'll get a good feel. Now, I will clarify this because of my age. People will think I made a mistake. When you get to the show, which is an hour long, the first half hour covers paranormal activity in, I believe it's Cleveland, Ohio. So stick with it or fast forward and we'll be the last half hour. Now, all these people came. We went to capacity that night in Saratoga. We showed it. We were so proud of it. And when we got done showing it, people were leaving the building. And as they left, about 1 out of every 2 or 3 people said, when are you going to have a ghost tour? Now, because Dave Patterson and I had a tour business, everybody kind of turned to me and said, could you write some kind of a, tour on this or something to make this come together? And I kind of thought about it for a while and I said, I don't want Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'd much rather have something that we just tell our stories, and we've always done that. And now we're very prominent in terms of the haunted trails in New York State use us. We have a lot of people that come through. We just recently, last Saturday, had an overnight, which are always fun, limited to 25 people. And it was
in the casino?
In the casino.
You couldn't pay me.
Wired totally by Old Saratoga Paranormal. And a couple psychics were there, and they have probably $10,000 or $11,000 worth of equipment, and put it all to use to try to pick up different stories and try to get to the bottom of things. And I've approached it from a more scientific point of view in terms of activities and things, but I do have to tell you, there's a lot of things that no matter how I start to look at them, I can't really explain them. And other people feel the same way. There is a lot of activity in that building. So next year we'll be starting those again in the spring. Summertime, we'll run them all summer. And then in the fall, it'll be very, very well documented, and you'll be able to join us for a lot of those. But they're fun, I think. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of really down to earth, this is what happened to us type of stories. So that's the ghost of the Canfield Casino.
So I've heard that it's supposed to be like a woman wearing a red dress.
White.
White dress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's up on the 3rd floor, right? 3rd
floor has been the most active. 2nd is really amping up right now. I'll tell you, they're really, they're chasing us. We've got a young girl.
Who are we chasing?
Well, Rabina is the figure, and her family is the one that really lives up on the 3rd floor. And we've had some new developments there. But on the 2nd floor, we received almost 3 years ago a oil painting of a young girl. And since that time, we've had a lot of activity from a young girl. and we believe her name is either Ava or Eva. And even the other night when we were in, she was very active. We've got a lot of film footage of apparitions and motions and movements. So second, third floor, yeah, we got a lot of activity. Yeah.
I'm staying on the first floor, thank you.
My wife does.
Yeah, I'm staying on the first floor.
Yeah, most of her family refuses to go to the third floor. But I gotta say, I do it all the time. I tell the stories of it. You know, I don't fear for my life or anything, but it's fun. It's fun. And from my scientific point of view, I kind of look at it as, hey, why not look at it with an open mind and see what happens and stuff like that.
So let's pull in the horses piece. So I thought, you know, talking about skeletons and the time of year and the hauntings, have there been any reports of hauntings at the track, or talk to us about the tie-in with the racing?
It's very interesting that you asked that, because someone posed that exact question probably 2 months ago, with the idea that we were looking at doing more of a haunted Saratoga for conventions and other things like that, because there's a lot of areas that do have ghost tours, etc. And that was posed, and I went back through all the research I had done, and I can't find anything. And I'm not an expert on the track, but I have to say I've never come across any real stories of any hauntings on the track or anything else. One of the things that I rest my hat on with this is Dave Pitkin always used to say to me that he believed that paranormal activity was based with residual energy, and that you had to have residual energy in order to get some kind of activity. And he always pointed to the fact that personal belongings had your energy.
And so there's tons of artifacts at the casino still housing energy, is what you're...
It's exactly right. And it's the first thing I went after.
Touched by humans many, many years ago.
Yeah, and a lot of belongings that were with them for their whole life and then willed to us or donated to us. I did a scatter diagram, typical scientific, look of all 3 floors when we first started, and I said, okay, what kind of activity has anybody had on the first, second, and third floor? And I tried to position it and then put certain indications as to what the stories were. There was virtually nothing on the first floor, but there's no personal belongings. It's all public space. Second floor, yes, and third floor is loaded with the Walworth family's personal belongings. We literally, in 1955, had willed to us the contents of a house that was on North Broadway, well, toward the north end of North Broadway.
Tell people that's the now the Ruin Realty building, correct? Or the site of the Ruin Realty?
Next door to it.
Where the Stewarts is, correct?
Yeah, it was a very prominent house. It was built in 1823. Reuben Hyde Walworth was the last chancellor of the state of New York. Prior to 1841, the chancellor was the highest ranking judge in the state. So as a result, he was the highest ranking judge, and his courtroom was in Albany. He had some power, so he moved the courtroom to Saratoga because he lived in Saratoga. He didn't want to go to Albany. It was before the first rail line came in 1832. So it wasn't a nice trip. So he moved the courtroom to Saratoga, and then he moved it into his house, which is a neat trick. But anyhow, that family lived there multiple generations up until 1955, and upon the death of the last member of the family, she willed the contents to us. We set it up as the individual rooms of that house up on the 3rd floor. And the neat part is we had a psychic probably 2.5 years ago that worked on it, and when she was done, I said to her, are you finished for today? She goes, yep. I said, did you find anything? She goes, yep. I said, well, you didn't tell me. And she goes, yep. Here it is. She said, they're all here. The whole family's here. And I said, why? And she goes, they think they're home. Yeah, it's all set up like their house. They don't understand they're not in that exact location. Now that building, like you alluded to, was torn down in 55. And when it did come down, it had different things on it. But it has the Stewarts today. It's right across from the city center. So,
right.
Yeah. So,
almost North Broadway. Right.
Yeah, almost. You have to cross the old tracks to be official North Broadway.
So let me tie in skeletons again. Let's go back to osteoporosis. So these people that we're talking about from the 1800s didn't live that long.
No.
We didn't talk about breaking bones as you got older back in the 1800s, because they didn't live to have the problems that we have now. We're living longer, we're living more active lives.
Sure.
And with that, we're noticing more troubles with our bones.
Yeah.
So let me go back to what I was talking about. It's primarily a discussion with women, but men develop osteoporosis and breaking your bones. Unfortunately, we're missing those. And I think maybe this talk will spur some people on to be like, maybe I need to ask about my bones as I get older.
I know personally, as soon as you hit on that, I was like, whoa, back it up, because I got to look into that.
Right, because you don't want to fall doing something that you normally do and break things.
That's right.
So we take a risk assessment and we do an x-ray. Let me get to I talked to my girlfriends about this, and they're asking me, well, when do we go get our first Dexas? And that's a great question, because different endocrine societies and osteoporosis societies say different things. Probably the best advice I could give is for women who don't have high risk fracture. You get your first assessment of that x-ray around 65. If there are risk factors involved, and most of us have risk factors, it's going to be younger than that. And it's usually within 5 to 10 years of menopause. Men, there's not a great recommendation when to do the first DEXA. So we do a risk assessment. And if there's a higher risk of fracture, then we would ask for a DEXA. That's an important thing. So they're done all over the place. Hospitals, imaging facilities, a lot of them have this imaging technique.
Okay.
However, the machine A is different from the machine B, is different from the machine X. So this is a piece of advice for everyone. Decide where you're going to chronically have your imaging done.
Oh, okay.
So it can be compared directly to each other.
Very
Unfortunately, our patients don't get that intelligence from whoever's ordering that, and they go to facility X or facility B, and we can't compare them directly. So it's really important, as for many other things that you're following chronically, they have them done at the same place.
That's a really good recommendation. I never thought about that. So
we recommend it for mammograms. We recommend it for surveillance, other types of imaging. But DEXA is really important because we can compare to them directly, or we can compare. We have a new baseline every time. And and the other thing is patients are moving around more. So like Mr. Patterson moves to Florida for the winter, if he has a study done in Florida, we can't compare it directly to one done in Saratoga. And so I recommend, when patients are moving around, let's have it done someplace where we know you're going to set roots down a little bit, and you can have it done sequentially.
Very good. Very smart.
It's beyond the scope of this to me to talk about treatment, and everyone wants to know, well, what are the treatments out there? The treatments are very individual. Some of them have been around for 40-something years, and they're still gold standard, and some of them are very new and novel. It really is a discussion with your doctor as to, what your treatment should be and what's the best for you, and when to treat. Not everybody needs treatment immediately. Right. Some people need treatment earlier. Here's the other piece. If you've had a fracture and the DEXA says, or the imaging says, that you only have low bone mass, a fracture equals osteoporosis. Okay. If it's been a fragility fracture, it is osteoporosis. I don't need any imaging to tell you that you need to be treated. We need to prevent the next fracture. Here's a statistic. 1 in 4 people who have a hip fracture will die within the first year from the consequences of the hip fracture. It's staggering information that people I don't think are aware. Yeah. Breaking something when you get older is a really big deal. So we want to prevent that.
Well, you've given me a lot to think about today.
Yes. Don't go break something on me. Yeah. So
very good. Well, one of the things we generally try to wrap up with or talk about is a little bit on horse racing. And now that it's fall and the Oklahoma track has closed, and that means the few young horses that were still there training have now moved probably down to Belmont or Aqueduct. Aqueduct is where the racing is right now. But one of the things that I was thinking of today prior to this was the fact that we really ought to remind people of what a gem, what a jewel we have in Saratoga, which is the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame. They've just put millions and millions of dollars into renovation there. Now, being president of the Saratoga Springs History Museum, this may sound like an interesting plug, but we're all in this together, and we have some amazing museums in Saratoga. And for those of you that may have tuned in with the idea of the title Health History Horses, maybe we could just wrap up by saying, you know, go over there and walk through and take a look at what they've done. It's staggering. The new electronics, the new movie itself, and they constantly have a wonderful job with their curator of new exhibits and tremendous amount of information. So as a wrap up with at least a plug for racing, I think we ought to tell everybody, get yourself over there, contact the National Museum of Racing. They're open, Wednesday through Sunday from 10 to 4, just like the History Museum is in lovely Congress Park. But Racing Museum is a standalone right on Union Avenue across from the Saratoga racetrack, and they'll give you everything you need. It's a great place if you're really into horse racing. Go there.
Even if you're not into horse racing, there are some really neat things. The artwork in there is amazing. The winnings and the trophies and all of the accolades in the trophy room are spectacular. So
absolutely, positively, they continue to do a very, very good job. And of course, they are a national museum of racing, and it's right here. And I think sometimes we forget that. So to kind of give that plug, I think it's very worthwhile. So yeah, good stuff.
Charlie, again, it's been a pleasure. Till the next time, we'll come up with something unique and
yes, we will.
and intelligent and knowledgeable, imparting on health history horses.
Thank you very much.